All right. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special edition of POST Wrestling's review of Queen of the Villains. I am your host, the Empress herself, Karen Peterson, and with me is one of my favorite people to talk wrestling with, who is part of the extended Post family. And for today, he is Post Wrestling's, not Grapple Spotlights, JP Houlihan. JP, welcome to the show.
Hello, you. How are you?
I'm
made
It's
up.
been a hot second.
It really has, hasn't it? It's been. We've managed to get here. I honestly, when I first thought this series was coming out, I have to say you're the person who came immediately to mind for this. I was like, I want to hear what Karen's take is on this as well, and I get to hear it by being sat in a virtual room with you to just talk about it. So I'm absolutely made up.
I kind of went around in circles when John Hanaway approached me about doing the review on this because I didn't know the best way to approach it. And also, for those who don't know, full disclosure, I've never hosted a show here at Post, so you get to be in the riding shotgun as we ride this crazy train all the way to the extreme evil alliance, as it were. But
that's
I'm
all right.
excited.
As long as you don't start stabbing me with a fork or hitting me with a kendo stick or choking me with a chain, then I think we are all good, Karen. We've got nothing to
Don't
worry
worry. I am exceptionally squeamish to when it comes to blood. So unlike our protagonist today, who goes into a flying rage, I pass out. So there will be no need for there will be no she's hardcore chance for this girl here. She's very much a soft girl. And for those who are familiar with my coverage here at Post, you'll see me with WH Park doing Post Perez or doing New Japan show reviews with my partner in crime, Bruce Lord, or my stuff at Dreamslam Weekly, Dreamslam Monthly. But when it comes to this era of Japanese women's wrestling and Japanese wrestling as a whole, I am probably below a novice. I've been like with the kid pushing his nose against the glass, kind of staring in, meaning like, I want to join them. I want to be there. So I'm excited, but I'm also very nervous to do this review. For those who are not familiar with All Japan Women's Wrestling, this series for Netflix is a 5-part series. And what I like about it is that in staying true to Japanese television culture, you're probably only going to get one season and that's it. There will probably not be a sequel. Usually most Japanese TV series tend to be contained to a singular season. So if there were to be any future versions of Queen of the Village, it would probably have to be a spin-off series focusing on whichever avenue. But of course, none of that is confirmed. But the biggest takeaway that I want to give everyone before we get started is this review is of Queen of the Villains, and Queen of the Villains is a fictional story based on real people and the events in the times of the late 1970s and early 1980s. And I think one of the interesting things about usually shows in Japan that have these, like when they do a historical drama piece of this kind, typically what happens is that they'll put this disclaimer at the very end of a television show. They won't start out in the opening sequence as many of film in Western countries do. When they do a biopic or something like that, they'll be like, this is a fictional reinterpretation of true events, or in in the event of true crime dramas, the names and faces and places have been changed to protect the innocent. This is very much at the tail end of the credits of every episode. There's just these 2 lines that say this is a fictional story. So with that in mind, the events that we're going to talk about in Queen of the Villains are based on actual work culture, life and times of women's wrestling in the heyday and the precursor to very much the 1990s of Japanese women's wrestling. But what you need to keep in mind is, yes, there are actual matches that get referenced in the series, but there are significant creative liberties taken by the screenwriter and the director of this piece. I just talking your ear off, JP.
Oh no, you're not. Because I should also apologize to any listeners as well, because for some reason my internet has decided to have an absolute paddy. like the at time of recording. So many apologies if you hear me go dark. It's not I've just decided, nah, that's enough for me. So apologies in advance for that. But no, you're right as well. And I think a show like this in some ways, it's not a it's not like a it's not a documentary. It's
Correct.
meant to have a bit of creative interpretation, and in some ways you want that from films and pieces as well, because if you have that just that literal retelling, the problem is you can get bogged down too much in the details, and you forget about the visuals, because this is obviously it's a visual medium. You also forget about the characters and that kind of character engagement, and so I expected that as well. And I suppose the biggest piece, and we'll no doubt end up talking about it, is really the idea of the scripted versus unscripted. But there's a part of me that my mind went back to My Dad is a Heel Pro Wrestler, where they did
So
something
good.
somewhat similar, and in some ways tonally, certainly for the first half of this, is very similar, I
Yeah.
think, to This Is a Series, where there's a kind of quite there's like a sweetness and naivete to it that's kind of endearing, that you want that. I in some ways, that if I wanted to watch a documentary series on All Japan women, then I'd watch all of the brilliant Kim Justice videos, or
Mhm.
there'd be as many podcasts for that. But so I think that bit of interpretation is sorely needed.
Yeah, and there's also a documentary that was done. Oh, let me get the exact name of it because I don't want to ruin it. It's the Gaia Girls documentary from 2000.
Oh,
It
we
was done.
reviewed that on the Patreon. Yeah.
It was done by Kim Longiato and Jonna Williams, but those directors actually have a second piece that came out 5 years before that called Shinjuku Boys. Did
Yep.
you have you watched Shinjuku Boys?
So I've got a DVD which has got Shinjuku Boys and Gaia Girls, and it was
You
released in
all
the
right? You need to
UK.
tell me where you found that because I was looking at it and they're like, there's on the eBay's, it's going for like $300, and I'm like,
What?
yeah,
I might have to seriously think about then putting that up on the eBays if that is the
yeah.
case.
It was listed at 300. I don't know if it's going for 300, but yeah, I was watching Shinjuku Boys this morning, and for those who don't know, Shinjuku Boys is another documentary that's done in 1995. About three transgender men working in the Shinjuku drinking district area of Tokyo. And back in the 90s, even then, it was the LGBTQ plus community is very closeted. And even though they're more and more frequently now, the gay community is becoming more transparent in Japan, they still face a lot of barriers, not just socially, but economically, and when it comes to having equal rights underneath the Japanese law. So for the not just the Gaia Girls documentary, but the Shinjuku Boys documentary to be done at the times that they were done was very groundbreaking. So they are available on the internet if you scour. I mean, you'll probably get it in 140p. It's not the best quality, but they are subtitled. So I'd recommend adding those to your viewing queues if you have not already.
I would. I mean, Gaia Girls, just as a weird side note, was actually on BBC Two over here. So it was on like
Really?
terrestrial TV. It was on as part of what? So there's a regular documentary, like kind of not series, but it's called Storyville. And
Okay.
generally, it's a lot of award-winning documentaries from all around the world. And I remember it was a wrestling documentary. It was on in the year 2000. I was like, well, I'm clearly going to be watching this. It probably came on TV
Obviously.
about 2002. And it kind of blew my mind because you never saw behind the scenes, let alone behind the scenes in Japan. That was just a non-starter.
Yeah.
And being like a recent film graduate as well, that was like, oh my God, like this was brilliant. And another weird kind of twist of face, like where I live in Oxfordshire in the UK, is also where Kim Longianotto lives. And
Really?
and she is someone who my film students who I teach, they have to study her work because it is generally revered as this kind of the best of like fly on the wall documentaries where
Mhm.
she doesn't take an active participatory role, which I mean, when you're watching Gaia Girls as well, there is, you realize how harsh the dojo life is. And it's almost like a
Mhm.
preparation for when you're watching Queen of Villains for like what dojo life is and about how just brutal and unrelenting and unforgiving it is as well. But obviously with Chigusa Nagayo as a kind of a completely different entity at this point, and a very, very young Meiko Satomura as well, who famously does a brutal drop kick to the face on a trainee that is just like, oh my God, horrible.
If I were to assign any homework to anyone listening to this podcast, it'd be to watch those documentaries.
Oh yeah.
And maybe we'll be including some reading material for those who are curious as we go along. But now here's one of the big debates when it comes to film, JP, as a fellow film student in arms. Are you a subtitle only guy? Do you watch the dub? What's your preferred viewing experience?
I can't do dubbed. It's subtitled. Now, this is the thing, as you know, you studied film. It is one of the things where you need to hear, for me, and I'm assuming as well for yourself, you need to hear the nuances of how people talk. You need to, you lose the emotion because you're taking away some of the direct like audio that's there and having to replace it with something else. Although, wasn't it the side note that Alexa Bliss, Lexi Kaufman did one of the voices for this as well? So that would have been possibly the only real novelty value. Yes. Although somebody said to me that I should watch the Mr. McMahon in different series just to see how Dave Meltzer's dubbed into different languages, to see how he's, just for shits and giggles, I think, as much.
I do believe I read somewhere that Lexi and Nikki Garcia, if we are to be believed that is the Nikki Garcia that I'm thinking of, they voiced the beauty pair. So, I mean, if you're going to pick an iconic duo to have one former WWE superstar, and Lexi is billed as WWE superstar Alexa Bliss, even though she's been on maternity leave and, enjoying mom life. They gave her the full government name for WWE.
This is the perfect, if you're going to do some work during your maternity leave, doing voiceover work for something like this seems to be absolutely spot on. So fair play to her. I'm assuming you would need them just if only to kind of get across the kind of like emote, because that would be the problem with any voice actor, I think, trying to dub this as well. And I can't do dubbed. I remember there was at one point I came in and my partner was watching Squid Game and it was dubbed. And I was just like, right, you need to get this off.
No.
Like we do this subtitled or we don't do this at all. Like I can't do that. And it's terrible for it. And Netflix at times will go automatically to dubbed, and I'm like, no, I'm turning that off.
That's one of my biggest pet peeves is the Netflix defaulting to English with subtitles because I'm in America, and I'm like, no, we're not going to do this here. The other frustration I often have with dubs, especially if it's a voice actor who isn't familiar with professional wrestling or sports, but like what you would call you don't want to say like the grunting that's involved in these kinds of sports, but some of the wrestlers the voice actors of the wrestlers for the English, at least on the English side, they sounded more like they were in a fighting, not necessarily a fighting movie, but like they didn't sound like they were wrestling. They just were like, the grunting didn't sound natural for what I'm used to hearing in a wrestling match, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, it'd be more like a video game, wouldn't it? It'd be more like, say, playing Street Fighter, and people just throwing in noises because they would have to. Whoever was doing like the voice for, say, a Chun-Li or someone along those lines. But yeah, it's something that I think it's people who going to dubbing is something I've never quite understood. Like I don't, because I think that's, it's one of the things that when you watch any series that's subtitled, you just get into the flow of it. Your eyes are able to do both things. It's like we don't almost give ourselves credit for it as well. And, you're able to kind of like be able to focus on what's the visuals and the text on the screen as well. So yeah, I think especially for this, especially for when you're getting into like the kind of the tone of voice, particularly when Dump has gone full blown heel, you need to have that down, because that change in voice and the way that she changes from when she's the absolute sweetheart for the first 3 episodes to then when she turns and you're like, oh, you can hear that there's there's a physical change in voice that the actress manages to do that is tremendous.
And that's one of the other difficult things, you know, as somebody who's been an anime fan since the 1990s, it's always the dub versus sub conversation when it comes to film consumption. But I've always found personally that when it comes to experiencing international cinema, if I really have a need to watch it in English, I'll try it. But I always like to listen, at least for the first time, I want to experience it in the original language as originally designed. But I understand the reason. Like, Netflix in this particular instance was very smart by making it internationally accessible, and not just by subbing it and dubbing it into English, but into multiple languages. Because when I pulled up the subtitles menu, just try to, panic switch it back to Japanese, I'm like, they've got Korean, Spanish, French. I'm like, there are too many options. Too many options makes it internationally accessible, which I think is a great thing. I just hope that, moving forward with other, like with my dad is a heel wrestler, if they were to ever re-release that onto DVD with, on a platform like Netflix where you can have multiple English or multiple language interpretations. The difficult thing is, again, interpreting words or phrases accurately. And also one of the things that I noticed that, some people, there was the discourse about was that there was inaccurate translations about very specific Japanese wrestling verbiage or vocabulary. I'm not going to nitpick it. It kind of, yes, I would have picked even some of the phrases that they use, I would have picked something differently. Like when we get into the nitty-gritty, Kaoru, when you first see the signs of her first, like, I don't want to call it a psychotic break, but our shift in personality, and she started screaming, they translated it as "don't disrespect me," which you could use, but for me, it would be more effective as "don't underestimate me, stop looking down at me." Like, there are different ways that you could do it to get the same concept across where it has a little more impact. So, but there's always, even with when Squid Game came out, there was a discourse about translation accuracy versus making it feel like the localization was more, plug and play, just throw it into a Google Translate, like AI translation, bare minimum translation, as opposed to using resources to ensure that the verbiage or the nuance is really there.
That's the eternal problem for translation, and translators in the main are never treated with the level of respect when it comes to, like, whether particularly for literary translation. They need to be on the front cover of the book. They need to be, for me, the author is there, but you need that translator there as well, because what they're doing is an interpretation. And this even goes back to when you'd have like translations of, say, Beowulf or something like that. Yeah. You need to have that level of respect there for the translator. And I found for this that, that's one of the things is, even though I can see what you said about the nuances of, say, don't disrespect me, when there is that confrontation with her father, at the same time, it also is, it's you've got the visual of the actor. So you're able to also tell exactly how they're coming across as well. And you get the mood. And we're lucky that we're kind of blessed, I think, with what for me is a real star-making performance, in Yurian Retriever, if I can quote her name, which is a hell of a name.
So do you know anything about Yurian Retriever?
Nothing at all.
Okay, so Yurian Retriever is a Japanese comedian. She belongs to one of the historically longest running Japanese entertainment and comedy companies known as Yoshimoto Kogyo. Part of the thing about Japanese comedians is that they tend, like, very much like you have Dump Matsumoto and Bull Nakano, they kind of mishmash a zippy nickname, or in this case, they use the word retriever, like a golden retriever. But Yurian is also a stage name. So it's kind of like a stage name in that sense, where because there are, like, you have very common names, like, for example, here in the States, you've got Karen, you've got Susan, you've got Margaret. There's a lot of, there's Yoshiko, Ryoko, Kyoko, so to help differentiate them and help the talent stand out, they give them a kind of, very few of them use an actual government name if it sounds too much like somebody else. But she actually made international headway a few years back on a very little, little program here in the States called America's Got Talent. There is a video that she actually auditioned. She didn't get far in it, but she did audition in it in a a very unflattering, and I say that because that's what she calls it, a very unflattering one-piece American flag bathing suit.
Wow.
Yes, I'll find the video and send it to you. And once this goes up, I'll attach that in the thread, because it is, to see her go through the Japanese audition for and in front of her peers, and they're all just like, "What are you doing? What are you doing exactly?"
I've just seen the pictures up on her IMDb, along with a picture of her stood alongside Jay-Z as well, which is like kind of unbelievable.
So in Japanese comedy, there are two very famous what you would call a Grand Prix, if you will. There is the M1 Grand Prix, because we love our abbreviations, and then there is the R1 Grand Prix. So the M1 is what they use for comedic duo. So if you and I were a team, we would try to get into the M1. It is hundreds and hundreds of comedic duos. And they basically do an audition process, kind of like, America's Got Talent. And then they narrow it down. And then on primetime TV, they have like the top 10 or top 20 perform. And then the judges vote to see who advances. The R1 is, I don't remember what the exact Japanese, like the expansion of it is, but it's for like comedians who are like kind of like stand-up comedians, but also individuals who do sketch comedy by themselves. So it's like a short form sketch comedy. And she tried for it 4 times, but she ended up winning it. And as a female in the field of comedy in Japan, it is very hard to win either the M1 or the R1, and she did. And largely in part to her interest in America and English and wanting to go to Hollywood one day, she would mix in English with her Japanese, and that was her comedy stick.
Oh wow.
Yeah. She's very fascinating, and she is moving to the United States. I believe she has expressed in the media that she's going to move to LA, very much like Naomi Watanabe, who used to be a Beyonce impersonator, is now in New York and going to Fashion Week and going to Cannes Film Festival. So she's a very fascinating character.
She's certainly got the acting chops for it. That would be the thing that I would get from her depiction here, because she is playing 2 very, very different roles.
Absolutely.
There were points when I was thrown out going, is this the same person?
I know, right?
The first 3 episodes. And that's credit to her for a lot of the great work that she does. And just the physical change, even with just a bit of hair dye and some face paint, and she's just a completely different human being.
And the interesting thing about the training that goes on is, because I know some of the people that have watched this, they've nitpicked the wrestling. And I will say this, 99% of the wrestling was done by the actresses who were trained by Chigusa Nagayo and Takumi Iroha. Like, while they were actively working on other projects, whether some of them were like pop stars, some of them are actresses, some of them, they're all in different parts of media in Japan. Mm-hmm. But they're using their off time to go to the Marvelous Dojo and to learn from scratch how to be a wrestler. They were doing conditioning, weight training. They had to put on weight. And in Japan, as an actress, if you're overweight, what they consider overweight, they still make fat jokes about you on TV and in the media. So it's one of those things, like, a lot of these girls are taking a career risk to put on, 10 to 20 pounds seems to be the average for most of the actresses. The Yurion Retriever had just lost 35 kilo and had to put back on 45 in order to play Dump. She's only just now lost 30 of the 45.
Oh, wow.
And they've been working on that for this project is like 3.5 years in the making. They started, actually more than that, because the casting started in 2020.
I can remember that being talk about the casting. That was a big thing. Yeah. But that's De Niro-esque. If you want to think of it like in for Raging Bull being the most sort of like famous example of someone who has to tone down and then enormously bulk up, and like the amount of like physical work that goes into it, and it pays off. I mean, we'll get into some of the wrestling scenes and stuff in a bit, but I was in some ways I had that expectation. I wasn't expecting them to suddenly go in, but it's I would say also to like Takuma Iroha, someone who is actually does a fair. I know obviously being like in Marvelous and then and having the spot appearances in Stardom, but also working quite a bit in the US for like West Coast Pro.
Mhm.
She seems to do like
She
quite
heads
a
over
bit.
to the UK too. And
Yeah,
sometimes she goes to RCW in Spain, which I think is all. I want to go to Barcelona to watch wrestling.
I've seen it's awesome. There was a promotion in Madrid that did it in like in a disused church, and he's like, "This looks great. I wanna go along to this."
But yeah, so it's one of the things where if you take that into consideration, and to the point where they had a premiere back in September on the 12th. Now, usually when you think movie premiere, red carpet, fancy dresses. No, no, no. For this, they rented out Korakuen Hall, put a wrestling ring in the middle of it, had all the legends at ringside on one side, had all the actresses at ringside on the other side, and had a 20-something minute match featuring the wrestlers of Marvelous and Takumi Iroha, Mio Momono, Maria, Riko Kawahata, who's also the great Sakuya, against who was it? Dash Chisako and a couple of other heels. And they were led out to the ring by the actresses who played Dump, Chigusa, and Lioness. So then they had a whole in-ring, while the match was going on, they had commentary with the director and Kiyono, who is an actual announcer in Japan who does announcing for New Japan and other promotions.
Yes.
But seeing him in polyester without his glasses on was the most jarring visual for me.
I was going to ask that because the first thing is like, I've seen him. I've seen this guy multiple times.
Yes, he's very familiar looking because he is familiar looking.
Oh, he is. And he's also like, I mean, I assume, does he work for TV Asahi as opposed to like New Japan?
I think he's either he works with the TV Asahi or he's a free announcer, meaning he can go wherever he wants. Like for those who remember the very weird movie Big Kaiju that stars Kota Ibushi and Minoru Suzuki, Haru Morata, who also does commentary for many Japanese promotions, is on that doing it as a newscaster.
That
was the best $5 I spent during the pandemic was buying that DVD because it is very much like old school Japan monster movie sci-fi. It is camp. It is fabulous. I'd highly recommend it if you can find it.
Incredibly Kota Ibushi as well.
It's very. When you do too much of the super magical gamma rays, whatever they put on him, and you turn it from Kota Ibushi and you turn into Minoru Suzuki, I don't know. it's a very fine line between the two of them, I guess. But yeah, so for all intents and purposes, for those who are listening, when we talk about the TV show moving forward, I'm going to try to use the names that are used in the series. Because I know there was a bit of discourse about it, it being called All Nippon Women's Wrestling as opposed to Zenjo or Zen Nihon or AJW. It was intentionally changed for the series. And when it comes to the group known as the Extreme Evil Alliance, the Goku Akudome, I keep wanting to say Dokugaku, but it's Goku Akudome. In English now here's an interesting fact for you, JP. Often in English translation and videos, I see it listed as Atrocious Alliance. I could not find a single printed source, including the Wrestling Observer, and I called my friend Kevin at PWI, and nobody can tell me where that specific translation came from.
Oh.
So, interestingly enough, All Japan Women's does have an official YouTube channel in which they release a series of videos that are going to be included in this episode that we talk about very briefly. So they released several matches in honor of this whole series between Dump and the Crush Gals, and they call it the Villainous Alliance because they have an English YouTube page and they call it the Villain. So honestly, Atrocious Alliance, Villainous Alliance. Either of those two words are very difficult for Japanese people to say because of the R and the L sound in it to begin with. So I'm not going to split hairs of it. The series calls it Extreme Evil Alliance. We're going with that one.
Yeah.
And also probably the other notable mention on this is Toyo TV8, which is the television station behind the TV deals related to the success of All Nippon women's wrestling in the series, which is actually a parallel to the actual the TV channel that is responsible for the broadcast rights initially, which is Fuji Television Channel 8, one of the largest broadcasting companies in Japan. And unfortunately, many of us might remember them very briefly from a show in 2020 called Terrace House, which featured Hana Kimura.
Yeah.
And the portrayal of Hana in the show, which resulted ultimately in the unfortunate loss of her life later on that year. So it's interesting to do that research and realize, connecting the dots, how long involved Fuji Television has been with wrestling as a whole. Although, for example, Stardom is listed on Nitele, which is another large broadcaster. New Japan is on TV Asahi. Those are three of the 4 or 5 major broadcast channels in Japan. So it was just really interesting for me to notice that, because the other tie-in is Yurion and one of the other girls named Ebi-chan. Now here's the thing. Ebi-chan, there's a very famous Ebi-chan from like the early aughts. She was like the modeling it girl. She's on the cover of every magazine, so everybody called her Ebi-chan, Ebi-chan, Ebi-chan. But when the girl who plays Crane Yu gets introduced as Ebi-chan, she's also a comedian from a manzai group, a duo named Mari Mari. I got very confused because I was expecting, Ebi-chan, the model from the late early 2000s, who's now in her 40s with kids, playing this character. And I was like, why doesn't this make sense to me? It's a different girl with the same last name.
Okay.
So Ebi-chan is a shortened form of Ebihara. So it's kind of like a nickname for her, but it just kept throwing me off.
I mean, I would say for those people watching that when they're watching the series, if they don't, unless you've got that deep, like already pre-existing kind of like, this is, massive fans of All Japan Women, very, very clued up to the kind of history and those finer details. These details, ultimately, they're not going to affect how you enjoy this or how you view this in any way, shape or form, I think. Like, they're not the things that are going to make you impacted. If anything, it's going to add an interesting layer to when you inevitably watch the series and go, right, I now want to go back and see how close this is, which is something that we all do, whether it's any depiction of like true crime or anything else. I know that people are doing it about the Menendez brothers or whatever for the Netflix series Monsters.
That's cropped up on my queue as well. And I'm like, after watching the Vince McMahon documentary, I'm like, I need a break from like the heavy concept
stuff.
Yeah, I need a palate cleanser, and of course that involves, a gratuitous amount of blood and beating up people with chains like you do. But yeah, so Yurion and Ebi-chan, they both work for Yoshimoto Kogyo, which is one of the longest running comedic troupes, as I mentioned earlier. And that company, unfortunately, ran into a bit of a pitfall a couple of years back, where some of their entertainers were kind of tied back to the what one would call the local crime syndicates. So the one interesting thing about, and because they originally got started in Osaka, or if anyone's watched Tokyo Vice on HBO or Max, or whatever it's called, I highly recommend reading Jake Adelstein's books. He has Tokyo Vice, and then the second one is called The Last of the Yakuza. Both of those books talk very heavily about the police beat and the history, and how, wrestling does make its way into the second book, because they do talk about the connections between why it's kind of frowned upon to have connections to what is called an antisocial club and the entertainment industry. So it was just interesting to see that, even to this day, a very notable company like Yoshimoto, even the actresses, they went to Osaka to one of the theaters where people go, it's just like they do like a little theater show, the stage play. They showed up and they just interrupted one of the shows, like you do, because they wanted to promote the movie or the series. So it was really exciting to see that crossover, that they're, the way that they promoted this series, they did so much between interviews and they did videos on YouTube, but but the fact that they were going into trying to get their foot in every single possible door to promote it is probably one of the smarter things they did, because the general public, as we will learn, wrestling is as popular as it is now. It cannot hold a candle to what is the equivalent of the Swifties, the K-pop stands, and Beatlemania all wrapped into one surrounding this time in Japanese women's wrestling.
Yeah, they really can't for this. And that is something I think if they get something right, if there's a finer detail that they had to kind of get right on this, it's that level of enthusiasm from the fans. Yeah. And it's that you may think, okay, people watching this about how hysterical they're getting. It's like, go back and watch the videos. You see those levels of hysteria. You see levels of emotion. Oh, yeah.
You hear them.
Unless you're deaf, which in my case, I fear that's happened to me sooner rather than later. Then
you and me both.
Like, it is that kind of thing where you just, hey, it's the podcasting curse, I think. But it is a thing where, like, this is emotion on like an entirely different scale. And you can understand like how it reached that, and whether it's gotten at all closer to has wrestling ever gotten to these levels ever again?
Maybe in a flash here or there, but not consistently over any particular rivalry that I could see. The closest might be Okada Omega, but even then it's not teenage girls screaming their heads off over it. I mean, there are some that do scream their heads off of it, but a lot of it's a more diverse crowd. It wasn't so like AJW is for the girls. That's what it was at that time before the men started taking over.
And it was, wasn't it? It was very much aimed like, and this is the thing to take away from it. It's almost like it's a demographic that wrestling doesn't go anywhere. It's like it can't get anywhere close to it at this day and age. And it's the kind of thing where you think, actually, this is an issue. This is something that I think wrestling has kind of forgotten about, where you have what is women's wrestling promotion that's aimed at women. That is the core audience. That's the audience they're going for. It's not going for another subset of male wrestling fans. Correct. And I always find that a bit more interesting. Any wrestling that isn't directly aimed at me, I'm immediately more interested in it as a result, because I go, yeah, I know what I kind of like, but I want to see things that are different.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing of that, especially this particular time area in Japan, because in Japan, like, so as you know, the current I'll make a new Japan comparison. Currently, we have the Reiwa Musketeers, which are associated with the current reign era of the current emperor. Before that, there was the Heisei era. So this particular setting in Japan, and you'll see it in the videos when you watch the matches, it's during the Showa period. Now, Showa is like a 65 or 67 year period in Japan that has a lot of nostalgia. Not just because it includes the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s, but it also includes the 50s, the 40s, and the post-war period in Japan. So it's something that a lot of people hold on to very much when we like look at the great days of like the 40s and 50s and that kind of nostalgia. The Showa period to Japanese people, that means a lot to them. So for me, I was born in Showa year 56, 1979. So we always joke that, I have a bit of nostalgia in that particular instance. And then the matches that on the YouTube channel, the date is written in Showa date. It's not in 1980 or 1970 year date. It is in Japanese imperial date.
Oh, okay. I didn't, so obviously for us, it just comes up as like 1984. 1980. Just
usually it's on the screen in the top left corner. It's in the Japanese date, which I think is kind of fun. But now in modern consistency with the rest of the world, they do use the Christian calendar or Gregorian, whatever you call it. I don't know what the proper term, the BCE version of it. But one of the interesting things about women's wrestling at this time is that there is, in the Showa era, there is very much a traditional Japanese archetype of woman, which they call the Yamato Nadeshiko. She's the ideal. She's elegant. She's quiet. She's submissive, but she's strong inside. And that's the standard to which everyone is held up. All women are held up to. You have to have your hair cut a certain way. You can't dye your hair. You have to look very, girl next door would be probably the Western equivalent is. And that's part of the charm of why the beauty pair take off in popularity because they're tall for Japanese standards. They're tall, they're athletic, they can sing, they can dance, but they also have that archetype gets broken down into two more modern popular types, which is the cool older sister, like you have your brother, your friend's hot older sister, and then you have the cute younger sister. So those are the two. And when you think of the beauty pair in like Jackie Sato, she's the cool older sister. Maki Ueda is the cute younger sister, and that is why so many high school girls are drawn to that, because that's what's popular. But the other thing that really draws girls to wrestling at this time is that that's not the only option. You have the heavier girls, you have the not so pretty girls, but they're all, when they're on the mat, they're all made equal. It's like the ring is the great equalizer in that sense.
Yeah.
And that time of wrestling in sports for women, it became very accessible, which is why teenage girls would cling to it, because teenage girls are still trying to figure out who they are. And when you have the standards of beauty in whichever culture you're in, and you're trying to figure out who you are, if you find something that you can identify with, especially when it's like, when you're at school, you can't really turn around and punch your bully in the face. You got wrestling. You're in the case of Dump Matsumoto, who's in an abusive household dynamic with her deadbeat dad who drives a truck and has a second family. Can't really do anything at home, but I can go to a show and watch someone beat the ever-loving tar out of someone 3 ways to Thursday. So it becomes wrestling in that sense at that time becomes very something that a lot of women who can't really express that outward rage or frustration, or they're like trying to deal with their own personality, it's something that they can cling on to, which is interesting in the sense that you are a man of the football. Do you know what the name of the Japanese national women's team is?
I don't. I feel like I should do, but I don't know.
So the men's team is called Samurai Blue.
Yep.
But the women's team is called Nadeshiko Japan, because it's supposed to express the strength and diversity of women in sport. That they are the current incarnation of it is what Japanese women should strive to be: strong, fierce, independent, work together. But the problem is that even now in the sports media, they go to the Olympics, they go to the World Cups, they often outlast the men in that respect. And yet still get told they're not feminine enough. The girls aren't pretty enough, that they're cutting their hair too short. So it's like, as much as Japan has expanded and evolved, there is still a very old mindset in a lot of things, even today.
And I think that mindset is very much, because what I like to think of, and in some ways I always think wrestling has always been on the cusp of this at points, which is we've seen a revolution in women's sports generally. Like, I think over here, for example, women's soccer would never get enormous crowds. I'd say this as an Arsenal fan, they would. No, it's a lower ticket price, but not by like a crazy amount. It'd be what would be the equivalent of sort of $15 to $20 if you want to go for a single ticket. But you would get 45, 50,000 for Arsenal women's games at the Emirates Stadium. They are appearing so much more when it comes to kind of like TV and TV advertising and just the casual mentions. There's a channel here for sort of preschoolers called CBeebies, and they had the England women's team captain Leah Williamson doing reading like a bedtime story and things like that. That wouldn't have been a thing that would have happened. And I think when watching this, you could kind of see the effect that the beauty pair in particular have, and then the Crush Girls as that slight kind of evolution of the beauty pair as well, of how that would be appealing to young women at that point in time. And it's something that certainly the series, like in episode 1, we kind of like thrown straight into it. It's like you're getting this idea of this. And I know when listening to Wade, he watched the Jackie Sato match, didn't he, as well? Like afterwards, this was something that he was just like, oh, okay, I need to see this. And I think I found myself doing this as well. I was like, okay, how close is she to the real thing? And you could see there was like, I mean, even if it's done within those traditional, okay, we want you to be an idol who sings, and we want you to do TV, and there's a sort of slightly demure, more of a demure nature to Makiida and Jackie Sato than what there is to Lioness Asuka and Chigusa Nagayo. Like, that's a very different, slightly different dynamic, but with that same kind of appeal. And I think that's, something certainly I think the show completely nails.
And I think what the interesting thing is that the director, when he wrote the screenplay, he based it off of hearing a series of interviews that Dump Matsumoto did. I think bringing Chigusa Nagayo on board as the like a special consultant and producer, as well as the trainer, like in an interview that she does with Bull Nakano on Bull Nakano's YouTube channel, which is really like the lineup of people that she has interviewed blows my mind. But she basically, most of the Matsunaga brothers, there were 5 of them. 4 of them were involved in the business. 3 of them were included in the series. But most of them have passed on at this point. Like, even when they started filming in 2020, 3 of the 5 had passed on, including all 3 of the ones that are included in the show. So a lot, and there isn't a lot of video footage of them. There's not a lot of photo footage of them. So basically, Chigusa had to help piece together like their memory for the production crew to help create a realistic interpretation that has depth of what they experienced. One of the things you will notice is that, if you listen to various podcasts or you read various, Western point of view interpretations of this period, when you watch the TV series, you will see that they kind of tone down a lot of the rumors or a lot of the things that we hear in the mainstream about what life was like at All Japan Women at this time. Whether it's interestingly enough, my boss, Mr. Pollock, he came in clutch and sent me a couple of articles that were done by Dave Meltzer in regards to All Japan Women, that one was dated April 4th, 2005. And it breaks my heart because I was still in Japan during April 4th, 2005, when All Japan Women had shuttered their business. And he did another piece, an obituary piece on the life of Takashi Matsunaga in July 2009 when he passed. They are paywalled articles, so for those who are looking for them, you will need to sling Uncle Dave some of your money, but they are very good reads in regards to adding context to this particular time, because there is a very limited amount of information in translation about All Japan Women's. There are 2 great books that I would recommend. One is Transformed Bodies and Gender Experiences of Women Pro Wrestlers in Japan by Dr. Keiko Aiba. She is a professor. She is still alive, but she's a professor at Meiji Gakuin in Tokyo. She did a research study on Japanese women's wrestlers in 2017. It is a published book. It is available for free. If you want the actual book, it's going to set you back about $50. But her publisher does have a free PDF of it. I highly recommend reading it. But in that, she does a cross section of women's wrestlers who work for companies and or freelancers at the time. And it is a cross section of those who worked between the 80s and the late 2000s. So there's some great pictures of, a very young Kana wrestling Mio Shirai, there, and some other pictures of like Shinobu Kondori. But for a lot of the things that you hear about, whether it's written by Dave in The Observer or on different in Pat LaPrade and Dan Murphy's Sisterhood of the Square Circle, the rise and history of women's wrestling. This is all told from the perspective of a female Japanese researcher who is a professor in Japan who interviewed a bunch of Japanese women. Now, keep in mind, in that book, every single wrestler she interviews has a pseudonym. So you will not find concrete, Bull Nakano said this happened. Akira Hokuto said this happened. They all have different names. But it is a fascinating read, and it ties into a lot of what we've been talking. Oh my gosh, for the last almost 50 minutes about what the expectation of being a woman in a professional sport in Japan is like, and specifically what happens to your body and your identity as a wrestler in Japan as a woman. So I've only gotten through half of it because it's a lot to unpack. But again, if you're going to talk about high level gender studies, yes, in this instance, wrestling is very political. And I've also gotten a couple of other books. One's on the Takarazuka, which is the all women, like, you know how kabuki is all men's acting? There is a female version that is all women acting, and they have a big theater in Osaka. Very hard to get tickets for. The tickets are very expensive. It's also a hobby of one Yota Tsuji is to go to see these, but they do like these fantastic stage productions, but all the actresses are women. And then I've got one about office ladies and salaried men, and then another one about a woman who did her research in a Tokyo hostess club in the 1980s. So,
oh wow,
the reading list that I put together that's not associated with this, but trying to get more, because in the 1980s, I was born in late 79, and by 1989 I was 10. So I don't really remember a lot of the 80s or what it was like to be a actual woman during that time period. So I've been doing a deep dive in some academic texts that I've really enjoyed. But if you want those details, I'll include those once the episode is live to all the peoples in the world. But I don't know if many of people are going to read them, but they do have fascinating things to include there. So now that we've gotten all of that out of the way.
But I think it's important for you to mention before you even get into it. I think it's really important to mention about the gender studies, because if nothing else in this, you'll go into this, if you're going into it completely blind, you'll hear about the 3 taboos that they mention. They don't mention the mandatory retirement at 26, which seems insane and is very much, I think, done as like you're viewing this from the prism of these older men viewing the women there as pieces of meat. And if they become too old, it's like an old Hollywood stereotype of not casting women of a certain age. And I can even, and seems like a weird reference I wasn't expecting. It's like when Susan Sarandon was starring in a John Grisham film called The Client. It was like this big deal,
gosh, yeah.
Susan Sarandon's starring like the lead in this film, and it's like, yeah, because that's how old the character is, and it's what makes sense. And she's a great actor. So why wouldn't you do that? But in terms of like those 3 taboos of like no dating, no drinking, no smoking, and just this kind of like heavy regimented, this is how you live your life. This is where you live. This is what you do. This is the time off is strict and scarce at that point. So there is this, you can feel like this patriarchal controlling aspect over their lives that no doubt the pieces you brought up there, will go into different detail in all manner of different industries. And I think it's important to kind of like, that's the undercurrent and the subtext of, I think, of this entire series. And it's also what makes Dump Matsumoto's like kind of response to it. Like, I think that's all the more shocking for that period of time of a woman who is just not going to play by any of those rules and by none of those standards.
Well, the interesting thing is that when I lived in Japan, I lived in a teeny tiny city called Tottori, which is west of Osaka and north of Hiroshima. Coincidentally, I used to ride my bicycle past the Tottori Municipal Gymnasium, where one local legend, Maki Ueda, won the Triple WA women's title. I did not know that Maki Ueda was from Tottori. And I found that out during my research. Yeah, you want to talk about a small world? The amount of eye-opening moments I had was fantastic. And interestingly enough, you were talking about the retirement age. So I was in Japan from 2003 to 2008. And on my 25th birthday, my divorce had just been finalized. I was living my best life in Japan. And my colleague, an older gentleman, came over to me with one of the senior English teachers, and because he didn't want to explain it, but because he had overheard the English teachers talking about it as a learning point for me, I learned about the concept of Christmas cake age. Do you know what Christmas cake age is?
No. Sounds terrible.
Well, Christmas is on the 24th and 25th. Nobody wants a Christmas cake after the 25th. So by my 26th birthday, I need to start thinking about getting married, starting a family. And
Oh
this
my
was in
God.
2000. This was in 2005. So it's one of those things where, even in the airline industry in Asia, a lot of the companies have a mandatory retirement age to this day. Like even at 30, they're getting pulled off the line and what you would call getting their wings clipped or grounded and having to work in the training center because they want to maintain that appearance that the only the young, wonderful, company face is dead at 26 apparently. So the retirement age part, I know, comes to a shock for a lot of viewers because it's not really discussed in it's hinted here by like, oh well, you broke the unspoken 3 taboos, but it feeds from idol culture where any particular idol or actress or actor or musician, it's the image of appearing perpetually single and readily accessible.
Yep. Yeah,
That's how you sell your merch. That's how you get your fan letters. That's how you get, you get onto TV. You get those magazine covers because people. It's the Paris. It was parasocialism before parasocialism was a thing, and monetizing that stardom, not the show, not the the company, but like the actual being, place of being. But yeah, so it's one of those things where when they look in the first episode, they're like, yeah, oh, you have a boyfriend, you got to break up with him. Why? What do I do after? It doesn't matter. What if somebody sees you? Like, and even to this day, that's still very much a very big issue in Japan, is that a lot of individuals in the sports industry and in entertainment, they have to keep their private lives very private. And that's why a lot of them keep it off social media, because if they get found out, it's a scandal. I mean, a prime example would be what happened to Tanahashi when he was a young lad doing the ladding things, and he kind of got stabbed for it. and that's the thing, is that in the opening episode when they're at the audition, it's very much like Team Edward, Team Jacob. Are you Team Jackie or Team Maki? After the big retirement match. That's like peak fan tribalism if I ever saw one.
Oh
But
God,
but it was you thought about it. It was like they were just trying to live their lives, but the company had such a stranglehold on every aspect of their life that like some of them rebelled against it.
Yeah. And even to this day, when it comes to, say, the personal lives of, like, if I ever think of like a Tanahashi or a Naito or even a Kada whose wife is famous in her own right as as an actor, I know nothing about them. Like, I would know nothing about like
You don't see their kids on social media.
Nope.
You hardly even see them with their spouse on this, or their partner on social media. Like, and even like Okada's a great example. When him and his wife went public, the Okada fans got mad at her for landing him, and her fans just went to town on Okada for taking away their idol. So it's terrifying but fascinating at the same time, that it's while it's changed somewhat, it hasn't changed all that much.
Yeah, it hasn't, has it? And it hasn't changed. Like, and I think, unfortunately, what it ends up promoting, sadly for me, is always like an element of immaturity in an audience, where like this is, and you mentioned about the parasocial aspect, the idea of this ownership they feel they have, whereas if you stand back from it, that's quite a toxic kind of, for me personally, I look at that as being quite
absolutely
toxic culture. I'm not interested in owning the people who I particularly like. I enjoy them for like what they're able to do as performers or as actors or as athletes. But that kind of level of ownership is something that I don't want any part of. Like,
no.
But that's something that still kind of exists to this day. And and the show itself as well, kind of, it straddles those lines.
Yeah. So it's one of those things where it's what you see in the series versus what is written in things like pieces like that Meltzer wrote, or that the other docuseries that we see, is that they kind of there's the concept of saving face in Japan, which is you don't air out your dirty laundry in public, and you certainly don't say things that would embarrass somebody else. Like having the stiff upper lip in this sense, or being the not being the nail that stands up because that's the first one to get hammered down. You really have to pick and choose your battles. And like there's this discussion about, when it comes to the folding of AJW, was that it was due to, ratings tanking, their forced retirement age, forcing women out who decided, well, if I'm not going to wrestle here because I'm too old, I'll just start up my own promotion. So, in the sense, the Matsunaga brothers are responsible for creating their own competition.
Yeah, they
because
did.
They were so hell bent on having fresh, new, young faces that they were kicking out some of their top talent and most heavily drawing talent in their prime.
Yeah, exactly. Even well before their prime. If you think of the prime of a wrestler these days, I mean, blimey, I mean, dare I say, because I'm of this age, but if you're thinking of like, I'd say early 40s to like, I'd say late 30s, early 40s is really that prime. We're talking well into it. You wouldn't do this in any other sport. You wouldn't you wouldn't get rid of people for it as well. But we should get into the show into the show itself in that regard, because I think these are the things that when you're watching and you're looking at this culture that the wrestlers are in and how they are, I think this is one of the great successes, I think, of this as a show, of kind of really making you feel what it's like in that kind of environment, and it's a pressure cooker environment that they're in as well, and that they're all very young, and there's a certain naivete that they have that the Matsunaga brothers frankly exploit, even if, as we say, they get kind of an easy ride here, really, don't they?
The character rehabilitation done by the director and probably the actresses, and more importantly Chigusa Nagayo, and probably the other legends that were included in the making of this, they were very kind about the portrayal of the Matsunaga brothers. And I feel like even how they were, when it came to them, breaking up the bathroom brawl or training them or smacking them or yelling at them, that's probably just a drop in the bucket of what actually happened. But I don't think we'll ever really know what truly happened, because unlike, Western media that's really into digging deep and exposing all the wounds, they seem more content with healing those wounds and moving on, mending those fences, even if it takes a very, very, very long time. But yeah, in episode 1, we are sorry. We are introduced to Kaoru Matsumoto and her younger sister Hiromi. It opens up on them collecting bottles to turn into the local alcohol vendor for recycling, basically recycling before recycling was in vogue. But to get some money just so they can buy a couple of treats on their way home from school. Typically in Japanese cinema and TV, this is typically what poor people would do just to get by, basically scrapping by. I mean, you see it in certain states here in the States that have recycling programs where you can turn in cans or bottles to get that nickel or that dime or just a little bit of change here and there. But they specifically do it to go get some candy and some little sausages to eat on their way home to go see mom. This whole series explores a lot of parent-child trauma, starting with the father, who is an absolute deadbeat. He's a truck driver by trade, but tends to be very bad at his job, just as bad as he is at being a husband. So the wife also works full-time, but she also moonlights, making money on the side, like hemming clothes and such as that. And so the dynamic first starts out thinking that she's a single mother. She's not exactly a single mother. She's a trucker's wife, but while Goro, the father, is out and about, he decides that he wants to set up a whole entire second family with another woman and name his firstborn child with this woman the same name as his own daughter, Kaoru.
Which is incredible.
That is a level of audacity. I want to know where they sell that level of audacity, because that's next level. But the hard part is that when it comes to family permissions and protections in Japan, throughout the series, Kaoru will press her mom as to why you don't leave him, why you don't divorce him, why you don't move on. But it's not like in the United States, I don't know about the UK, but like there's not really a concept of alimony in Japan. So if she were to leave him, he doesn't have to pay child support. She's on her own. Those kids, like, he doesn't need to worry about that. Of course, he starts whistling a different tune when he gets really sick and he can't work anymore. But basically, he goes as far as to steal the girl's lunch money. And in Japanese elementary schools, you have to obviously pay for school lunch, but the kids are for most kids, that is probably that are in Kaoru's situation. That's probably the most well-balanced, proper meal they're going to eat all day. Mm. And the classmates serve it, the teachers help serve it, obviously, but it's very much a very integral part of the culture. And if the kids can't eat food with their classmates, they get further ostracized, because then they know that either they're poor or there's problems at home. And it's not like there's a benevolent other family that's going to like drop extra money to, because like school lunch is well balanced, but it's also very expensive. So the fact that the dad was going after the school lunch money, I'm like, you son of a bitch! I got so mad at that.
Oh, it's. I mean, and I think this is one of the great things that they managed to set up in the show. Is like, well, what is the motivation for someone who, and we would have said this before, like for the first 3 episodes, comes across as lovely, sweet, kind, doesn't really want to be nasty or violent within the ring, doesn't want to hit people, because she's quite shy and quite timid in that way as well. But it's the relationship with the father is the driving force for what makes her become Dump Matsumoto. And you mentioned earlier on about the translation to go from her being thought of as a particular of her being disrespected. That comes down to the father, and it comes down to several moments, because when you see them in the house is minuscule. It's absolutely tiny. And
it's a rented room on it's like a rented flat on like a little tiny building. And yes, they do look that dilapidated and that earthquake prone. So her and Goro at separate times getting thrown through the wall. It doesn't really surprise me, because some of them, if you're driving a truck and the whole house shakes, it's probably not the most structurally sound one to have.
I'm amazed it was standing by the end of the show as well.
I'm curious to know how much was spent to, paste the wall back on the house.
It is. You mentioned there very quickly about budget in terms of how they did this. Like from a production perspective, this is very well produced.
Yes.
Like this is something that it doesn't spare expense. It's not needlessly expensive. It's not overly flashy, but like you get that location, you get the idea of the kind of poverty that she's living in.
Yeah.
The way Kurikan, you don't see, I wish wrestling was shot in the way that it is for large swathes of this program as well. Like, and just that, there's that Netflix sheen that frankly you're quite used to seeing, that we take for granted on so many shows. But when it comes to wrestling, you don't often see.
Well, and the other thing about it is that, when you think of Netflix produced series, you're thinking of a Western budget. You're thinking of a Hollywood budget, or, a UK series budget. But Japan, well, they tend to have a far smaller budget, but they were able to do so much with the series, to the point where it was you can see how much thought was put into everything, even from the casting call, the costuming. I love the costuming in the series. But it was just like they had so many small nods to so many small, different things. But again, if you look at it through the lens of that this program isn't designed for the weirdos like us. It's designed for the everyday Joe Schmo watching at home, to make wrestling and wrestling history accessible and interesting, to hopefully drive you to a show, to hopefully, make you pick up a book or look up a video or a match. But yeah, between the rigors of the 100 plus person audition, Apparently, once the Crush Girls took off in popularity, those went up to thousands of like applications because everybody wanted to be the next set of Crush Girls. The different walks of life that everybody comes from, some like for in the instance of Chigusa, her parents abandoned her and left her with relatives because they had a debt that a loan shark was chasing them. So they run off to Osaka, leaving her with her relatives, and she just basically gets shuffled from house to house to house to house. But then this is her one opportunity to get out of that, and she runs to Tokyo and ends up sleeping in the dojo after she gets picked because she has literally nowhere else to go. And
Which is, sorry.
No,
sorry
go ahead. No,
I was going to say, and that's the basis of how they become friends. There is this kind of shared, like, and I think this is probably one of my favorite scenes from the entire program in the build up, that you have these two as trainees. She finds her sleeping underneath the ring as well. There's that shared kind of like, whether abandonment from family, the poverty that they're living in, and just the desire to escape from it, which then leads to them going out collecting bottles like she does with her little sister when she's a kid. And then with that money, what do they do with it? They go out. They go out. They do the thing they're not meant to do and go to a nightclub and have a drink, which then actually interestingly becomes like a really good plot point. And again, part of the motivation of Dump as a heel character. And I thought that was dramatic license. Yeah. Because what Chigusa Nagayo does is give an interview and basically say, oh, well, I was never... She says, I went to a nightclub by myself. And then within the show, it's like, actually, no, she went with Kaoru. Yeah. So as a result of that, because she went to this interview there, my baby son has just walked into the room. So there may be a possibility.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you learn very quickly, how important in Japan at the time, keeping kayfabe was, to the point where you're getting actual hate letters from people, and you can't just like go onto Twitter and be like, who sent me this letter with razor blades, or who sent me this voodoo doll of me, or who sent these few, like, so you'll see some photographs that are like wrapped with like black ribbon with a black frame. Those are typically displayed at funerals when somebody dies. So basically it's like somebody's way of saying you're dead to me. Like a lot of the fan behavior in this is out of control. But it's also when it comes to Chigusa, and we talk about the Matsunaga brothers, pitting, like doing a pseudo, was it Darren Aronofsky, like pitting the girls against each other, omitting certain, giving half truths or omitting truths altogether, or creating miscommunication for the sake of driving the business. The sports media heavily plays into this because I'm fairly certain that was a weekly pro wrestling, a shoe pro interview where, they're having this heart to heart girls night out. We are best friends. We'll do this together. And then all of a sudden it comes out that, their Chigusa like completely like flips the script on her. It's like, yeah, I was all alone. There was nobody for me. Like I would see that as Chigusa became the person that Dump clung on to. Yeah. Because when she was struggling in training, when they were struggling for everything else, Chigusa was always the one that was like cheering her on and trying to draw that out of her. And for her to just be like, yeah, no, the person who really saved me in wrestling was Asuka, my tag partner. And it's like, after all, I'm like, you wonder why this girl took a fork to your forehead? You brought this upon yourself. But it's also, was that the story that Chigusa wanted to tell? Was it the story that the Matsunaga brothers wanted her to tell? Is it the story that the media would prefer to tell because it sells more issues? Because the Toyo TV agent also becomes a very large player and pits the Matsunaga brothers against one another, being like, here's your opportunity to have that prime time, golden time, 8 p.m. TV slot, but you have to do XYZ. You have to sacrifice the integrity and possibly the safety and or livelihood of several of your wrestlers. But don't worry, you'll have that nice new car. You'll have the money for that nice new house. And the greed is very understated in this series. But when I could not imagine having just like opening up a safe and taking out a stack of cash and being like, here's your bonus. Oh, look, it can stand on its side because those stacks are so thick with 3 C's. Like, it just blew my mind. They're just like, here's cash. Like I'm pretty sure that cash is probably more than I make in like a year, if not several years.
That is the thing, and we have to mention really about the Matsunaga brothers, because they're fascinating characters in this.
Yes.
We have the three of them there, one of which is a president who's kind of very much like literally watching the matchup in the gods, who's quite far removed from some of the stuff, and he's almost like he's viewing this in a very different way. I want to say, is it Toshikuni, who's like got the longer hair, he's like the youngest brother,
The
with
youngest
the
one. He's the youngest of 5.
Oh, okay. And he's like, in some ways, he's trying to sports entertain,
yes,
like all Japan women. You get the impression of that. And then you've got a middle brother there who, I mean, at times he's like quite a horrible character. There's a scene where he's slapping around Chigusa Nagayo in the dressing room, just like being, and it's uncomfortable to watch.
Yes,
because it's male on female violence.
Yes,
and you're watching this and you're going like, oh, hang on a minute, this is tonally like a bit of a shift, but you can easily believe that this happens. That doesn't surprise you in the slightest.
What notes I remember from the Meltzer article, because he talks about when in the passing of Takashi, the eldest son, or the eldest brother portrayed in the series. He's actually the middle child. The 2 eldest brothers, one was also affiliated, that was Kenji, but he passed away in 2020, but he was involved as president when Takashi was chairman. But he's not really referenced in the series. And then the eldest brother was not involved in the promotion, not named in the series. But also, like, they were they're historically, they had like, they were in MMA. Takashi married like the wives and like the in-laws. They bring wrestlers into the family. They're just not included in this particular portrayal. That you see them as like background, like you see like there's like a woman there, but you don't really know what her affiliation is with them.
It's when Toshikuni goes to visit his house and he lives in this massive house, and that's
massive
one of the
house
that they did.
A house like that in Tokyo, I could not imagine what that house cost. Like,
that's what they spent their money on, wasn't it? Was they got
involved? They got involved in real estate, and when the bubble economy popped and they lost a whole lot of money, it didn't end well for them. But yeah, so Takashi is he's the one serving the yakisoba. He's the one who convinces Kaoru to try out. It's like if you think of it this way, imagine Tanahashi just like slinging yakisoba, and you have no idea who he is. He's just slinging soba in the lobby. He's like, "Oh, come to try," and you walk in, and he's like sat dead center, and you're like, sir, why did you want me here? You want me to audition? But yeah, Kunimatsu was the middle of the younger brothers, who's the one who handled the bullying in the bathroom, as it were. But he's also the one who was in charge of the dojo system and the training. So you do see him get in the girls' faces. You see him yell at them. You do see him strike them. And he very much protects the senior wrestlers over the junior wrestlers. And that's a whole issue that comes into play throughout the series, is the concept of joge kanke, which is the senpais and the kohais, and how you have to, even though they may be the same age and or younger than you, if they entered the corporate ladder before you, you automatically have to give them respect, whether they deserve it or not. And I feel like they may have gone as far as they could in regards to the bullying, the hazing, and the potential abuse without doing too much character assassination, because a lot of the Matsunaga brothers, if I don't know if the oldest one is still alive, but all the other ones are dead. So I don't think they wanted to disparage the those who are not amongst the living anymore. So they touch on it very lightly, but I also feel like they kind of wanted to protect them for the sake of making a good production and not making it a hit piece.
That's it. And I think that you've kind of hit the nail on the head. And it's really the tone that the show carries, is that you are aware that there is a darker story that could be told here. But would that serve for the kind of story they're wanting to tell, the audience they're wanting to reach, who maybe it's not meant to be like the dark side of Joshi, you're not wanting that as well. But it still includes lots of these things. You see it in particular with Devil Masami.
Yeah.
Who, like, several times is very much like, I am a senior. I do not, like, won't talk to Kaoru for large swathes of it. Is very bullying of Chigusa Nagayo. Like there is like it's a very interesting kind of dynamic that it's at play, and that is like kind of integral to this because we see it obviously with Jackie Sato at the beginning, and then it moves on, and then we have almost like that crop of wrestlers who come through together. Is that including Jaguar Yokota as well?
So Jaguar Yokota is in the class just before them.
Ah, right.
So that becomes the difficult part because the struggle. It's very understated, the struggle of Jaguar Yokota in this series, because she says it point blank to them at one point. She's like, "I'm the champion, but I don't feel like the champion. I've got the wrestling ability, but I don't have the star power. Stop using. I'm supposed to be your top champion, and yet you're letting the Crush girls do all this. You're letting Dump do all this, but you're not letting me have this. Why are you not treating me like I'm the most important person in your promotion right now?"
Yeah,
Go ahead.
And I was thinking that's what the youngest of the Matsunaga brothers ends up really kind of like, he understands it. And he says it in one of the, when we get to the big Dump Matsumoto Chigusa Nagayo match, the hair versus hair match. And he's believing all along, well, she's going to be putting him, she's going to be putting Chigusa over. And she's like, but actually what she's doing, she's showing how she's able to perform and be a star. Something that he thinks that Chigusa is not able to do to the level that Dump can.
Yeah.
And it kind of like it's this interesting dynamic about there's a certain wrestlers there who believe that they should be based on skill and ability, whereas they're looking at this as, no, we need to create stars. We want to create idols. And in that's going to take you so far, but it's not going to be enough. Which is very much the way of modern sports and the way of modern wrestling today and sports entertainment. It's not on ability as much. If we did, then, you know, blimey, we'd be talking about the Daniel Garcia sort of like, you know, 10-year reign in wrestling. It isn't based on that. It's based on that kind of crowd connection and those kind of aspects to it, which is what Dump manages to get out of Chigusa and then they elevate themselves in that level through their machinations of making them hate each other as well, and their own kind of interpersonal dynamic.
Absolutely. And the other difficult thing is that what the Matsunaga brothers want versus what they're able to actually control, especially in the later episodes. Like at some point, Takashi, the oldest of the three, catches on that his youngest brother is in cahoots with his brother is chasing glory and wants those TV rights, but he's also sabotaging the work that he's doing. So the point that stands out to me the most was when Chigusa's like, "I'm the star." I'm like, Chigusa she gets a bit of a swelled head later on where she's like, "I need to be the one at the Budokan. I need to be the one winning this tournament. You need to tell Asuka she needs to lose." And Takashi's like, I see what you're saying. And then he walks right next door and doesn't say anything to her and just walks right off.
Yep.
And so when she loses her mind because she's like, "I thought you were going to fix it." He's like, "No, at the end of the day, this is supposed to be a talent-based tournament. She beat you." And then, you know, the whole thing with Dump happens where she storms out to the match after Asuka's already won it because, you know, she got knocked the you-know-what out. And then they set up their Osaka Joe Hall match for the hair versus hair match. And like, they were so strategic and almost, I would almost say they were good about pitting them against each other, but they never did anything to diffuse the real life animosity. They never did anything to stop the fan letters with razor blades that were coming in. They weren't helping the situation because they got obsessed with the profit and the bottom line and getting that TV deal, that they didn't realize that the girls were just like actually destroying each other.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting when you mentioned, like, it's one of the key, you know, another key scene when she opens up the letters and there's razor blades in there, and it's like, actually stick this up. This is our motivation. And to put all this stuff up on the wall as well. Just absolutely embrace all of this hate. Dare I say it? Like, and I know you say like they're very good at it. It is this thing, like, begrudgingly you go, well, it's kind of good promotion, but it's also interesting within the show. normally you think for wrestling shows, they would base it around, well, who is the champion? Champion is the person you go for. The champion is incredibly secondary for large swathes of this. It's like whoever is champion at that point in time, like, and you see it with the Jaguar Yokota kind of like with the lines where you said earlier on, she says, like, I'm the champion, but I don't feel like the champion. It's like the champion is secondary to it. It's this blood feud is the thing that's driving the business and everything else. And I suppose we have to talk about it because it is this, if it is something that's going to bother a more hardcore audience, I think, is the idea of scripted matches versus unscripted, because the show plays, if there is a criticism, which actually didn't bother me nearly as much as I thought it would do. If you told me beforehand that there would be a point where it's not ready to rumble, you know, it's not this idea that, you know, oh, wrestling is absolutely real and this is what happens, and we do not break that at all. Because in Ready to Rumble, I mean, it's a horrible film at the best of times. What do you expect when it's a David Arquette comedy, for crying out loud, with latter-day WCW? But in here, there's this element of, well, yeah, there is the scripted, but I looked at the unscripted as more, it's displays of fighting spirit as much as anything else. They're still, you know, they're still selling for each other. They're still, you know, if they did, an Irish whip would never happen. Like, it wouldn't happen. You just stop dead in your tracks and go, I'm not running over there. Why would I do that? We just end up punching each other. So it does play more, as I viewed, and this is where I said earlier on about the, like, how it felt kind of like My Dad is a Heel pro wrestler, because it did very much a similar thing, where it was about how hard you fight, as opposed to the kind of like the winning and losing. And the unscripted tournament it has is kind of along those lines. Yeah, with Dump effectively playing the role of New Jack, in that she just doesn't have to play by any set of rules whatsoever, and stabbing referees and the like as well, which it is proper violent, by the way. If you don't like blood in this show, like, Jesus Christ, like,
just be aware that a lot of it happens. A lot happens. But no, the one thing that made me laugh about it was when they were talking about the Grand Prix, is that they're like, it's based on ability, and I'm like, you say that, and yet you're letting Dump Matsumoto, who you've consistently hated how she wrestles from the time you brought her into the company. Yeah. Okay, sure. But at one point, it's the wrestlers also get so fed up with her antics, where it's like, she's a liability. What are you going to do about it? And they're like, oh, just let it ride. Like, let it play out. And we're like, no, she's going to send people to the hospital or the morgue. That's where we're getting to with this. But
it's like having a garbage wrestler in a G1, but because they're massively over, you're giving them the big push.
And you're like, it would be, not that he's a garbage wrestler, but if you were going to let Jon Moxley just bloody up every single person, or Gabe Kidd bloody up every single person during every single match. Again, I'm not saying they're trash wrestlers. They're very good in their own unique ways. I'm just trying to give you a visual of how I see it.
Yeah, it is. It would be.
It's just the. I know there was a bit of criticism when it comes to, like, well, why is it called Queen of the Villains if there's so much Chigusa Nagayo and Lioness Asuka discourse in the series? And I'm like, you. One of the biggest things that they talk about in this, especially even in the very uncomfortable bullying in the bathroom scene, is you can't wrestle by yourself. You need to have an opponent. So in order for Dump to become who she is, you have to tell the story of the meteoric rise of the Crush Gals. You have to see them pulling away from the pack and leaving Dump and Honjo and the other girls behind, as they all of a sudden, like, they're moving out of the dojos too quick. They're getting their own. They're doing interviews with New Japan wrestlers for Shoe Pro and everything like that. They're on TV, and you're like, well, what about us? I thought we were, we're classmates. We're rookies together. We're supposed to be a team. And then just taking that plus whatever's happening at home, turning it to 12, and basically having the equivalent. I'm not going to diagnose someone, but what comes off as a psychotic break where she just wants to murder everyone, even if these people are supposed to be her friends or her colleagues or her family.
Now, in the hands of other lesser actors, some of that would have come across quite badly.
I think so too.
But because Urian Retriever is so great in this role, you're fine with it, and you need a supporting cast, obviously, but you also need them to mean something. And they all do mean something. Even the ones who, like, I mean, I want to say Crane Yu, who isn't a big part of the story, but it's certainly an important part, and somebody who forms like a base for that character, particularly when she moves out of the dojo and just says, well, no, I'm moving in, or you can't move in alongside faces. And she just goes, that's just constructed by the company. Like, why are you going along with this? And I think, like, you have to tell what if you're looking at it in a very sort of simplistic way, you'd say, oh, well, it's just Chigusa Nagayo as a consulting producer, as sort of like effectively making sure she is elevated. And it's like, well, no, it's like, even though she is this big role, it's not about her all of the time. She is like a well-developed, flawed character in this. Like she is very flawed, and it's those perils of stardom, and you get that. But you also need to have the whole, like, in order to tell the Dump Matsumoto story, you have to have the Crush Gals. And it's better to think of it that way. It's just that Dump is like an easier, more relatable figure to kind of tell this story with. And I think and again, that's just all credit down to the actor as well, which if you go to IMDb page, it comes up with all the adverts she ever seems to have done for things like Nike and stuff like that. Because I saw it playing in the background while I've been talking, and it's just like, wow, like she's not short of work, particularly on the advertising front. She's doing okay for herself, and when she gets to LA, she'll be doing a whole lot better as well, I'd imagine.
And that's the other thing that I really liked about whoever cast these actresses in these roles really deserves a raise. And in particular, whoever cast the girl, oh god, what's her name? I want to give her name because the way she pulled on my heartstrings as Bull Nakano just blew my mind. Yes, what is her name? Momoko Hori. She was the most soft-spoken, timid person, and then like when you see her at the premiere, that's really how she is. She's a very shy, very, very like, anxious girl. And I haven't seen, of the actresses that are portrayed in this series, it doesn't seem any of them have a negative thing to say about it. Like even Jaguar Yokota, who is like, could be the somewhat, big leaguing bad person in the group. She did an interview for radio where they had the actress who played her, and she calls her my Yokota-chan. She's like, this is my Yokota. If Jaguar Yokota can give you that level of endorsement, knowing that her part of the story is very much I did everything I could to help carry this company, and I was put in a hard place by having to retire Jackie, and then no sooner do I, start to gain momentum, you just throw these other people like way over me, and I just have to go to Mexico and like have fun over there when nobody asks about me. That says a lot. And it's like, Chigusa Nagayo did an interview with Bull Nakano where they were talking about the taping, and she's like, I walked past Urian and Hori as Dump and Bull, and I had to do a double take. That's how spot on the mannerisms were, the way they carried themselves were. And that says a lot about the actresses that, they weren't just willing to learn what they need to do the scenes, that they went above and beyond to really get themselves like into the characters. And even the girl who played Chigusa in the film or series, she almost dropped out of the production because she was having a tough time with it. Like she wasn't gaining weight. She was struggling with the wrestling. So it was interesting how like art was imitating life, imitating art, imitating life, like the whole circular argument.
I think, this is, and again, credit to all of the actors involved in this. They are completely believable and and this is the thing I would recommend for anyone listening to this, in terms of go out and search for those matches, particularly like you mentioned about Bull, the character plays Bull Nakano, the way that she puts, like, there's a point where, and I'm sure it didn't really happen this way, but Dump sort of puts her head down and just takes out some clippers and starts shaving. And then WWE had released, and like when this show had come out, From the Vault of when
I saw that.
Her and Dump Matsumoto wrestled in WWF at that point in time, and it's terrifying. Like how like there's that attention to detail. They nailed it. I mean, they nailed all of the costume choices, which you mentioned earlier on, absolutely fabulous in there as well. But every one of those actors, you are completely convinced by, even if, and this is, I suppose, one of the other things I mentioned about like how good the wrestling scenes are. I think you find yourself going, well, they're fine. They're generally okay. They're not like, I didn't have the expectation that they'd be pulling off like kind of chain wrestling masterpieces. But then when
Yeah.
you watch a lot of the matches themselves, they have that style of 70s and 80s wrestling,
Hmm.
which is very kind of rough around the edges, quite brawl heavy. That not everything is clean, but in some ways, I like my wrestling like that. I
Yeah.
don't want it to be smooth and shiny because that's the kind of product we get today, where you know any kind of a slight misstep and there'll be people criticizing and taking
Hmm.
off half a star and whatever, and that kind of discourse. Here, it's the idea of people who are just throwing themselves all into something, and if it goes wrong, then it goes wrong within the ring, and it's actually about kind of like how hard you hit more than anything else, and it's how Dump Matsumoto is able to get around her own shortcomings as a wrestler, which you see in those first 3 episodes. But the time she turns into Dump, she's walking, brawling, and in some ways is, like I mentioned earlier on, there's a comparison with like kind of New Jack matches in ECW. But like she's able to do that, and that works, and it connects with the audience. So like, it feels like it at those points, it is actually much more closer to the real thing than what you would have expected.
Yeah, the one of the things that I really liked was that they touch upon very key points in the company's history and crucial matches, especially when it comes to that hair versus hair match. And for those who may have heard my Stardom reviews way back when Julia and Tam had their hair versus hair match,
That was
to
great.
yeah. It's one of those things that's why it happens very few and far between, at least in Japanese women's wrestling, is that you have to have a blood feud level of
Yep.
situational storytelling to have that happen. But it's one of those things, like I've said before, is that in Japan, they always say like a woman's hair is her life. So the fact that the match ended, like they want, the expectation was that Chigusa would win, and oh yeah, the good triumphs over evil. But the fact that the visceral, if you have the chance to watch the matches that are referenced in this, there is a playlist that I put in Dream Slam Monthly that came out, and I will append it to this the show notes for this one. The sounds of the wrestlers crying at ringside and the fans in what you can only be described as absolute agony over watching. Now, mind you, she's been beat up a fair bit, but watching her get like the humiliation of having her head shaved on primetime TV, which ultimately cost them to lose the live broadcast rights. I don't know if that's historically accurate enough, but you know what? Knowing how defensive and sensitive people are about their hair in Japan when it comes to going back to the talk about a woman's the ideal image of a woman, usually shaved bald after a bloody fight. Not necessarily, not everyone can pull off the Charlize Theron shaved head or the Julia shaved head, as it were. And then of course there's they hint about it, but they don't really talk about it, of course, which they still don't talk about it that much in Japan today, is the mental health issue that goes along with Chigusa turning into a shut-in after losing her match. Because she has to deal with the humiliation of losing, and she's already lost the tournament to right before that, and she starts taking everything out on Asuka because her parents, yes, they show up when they show up and show out for her when at that hair versus hair match in Osaka. But then she's back by herself in her Tokyo apartment all alone, and she has no support system. And she just decides to start taking out on her and Asuka start to have a conflict of interest as opposed to what philosophy of wrestling they want to have.
Oh,
in the
that,
sense that Asuka's like, I'm here to wrestle. We're supposed to be doing the wrestling. And then it seems like Chigusa's character in the series gets so wrapped up in this, she gets carried away with the stardom aspect of it. Like that she, like they've got the singles, they're doing TV shows, they're in the studio, they're doing all of the entertainment things. So it becomes like, well, are we entertainers or are we wrestlers? Are we, and that's where, we still have that disparity today. Are wrestlers sports entertainers or are they wrestlers? And what's the difference?
And that's the I think that part of the dynamic between Lioness Asuka and Chigusa Nagayo is like, again, one of the really strong parts of this show, and the conversations they're having about just the struggles. They kind of forget who they are, and they forget who they are when they're together. And it's the idea that Lioness is having to do all of the things that Chigusa wants to do.
And she doesn't want to do them.
And she doesn't want to do them. She is her own person in her own right as well. And she wants to have effectively, if we thought about this in modern kind of wrestling parlance, you just go, well, yeah, you have them tag together and become big. So when they do break up, they have the big money feud together. It seems like kind of nonsensical, but that isn't the thought process. And I think that's another thing to take from this, is that it's interesting to hear, like, it's a different take ultimately on how you feel about wrestling. And I think those Western tropes and cliches that we often see in wrestling, that is something that they, like, I think they pretty much kind of nail, and so it makes you think about wrestling in a different way, because it doesn't have that what we would think of as Americanized Western wrestling kind of like dynamics, where your tag partner is there ultimately for you to feud with. Here, they're being looked at as, no, we're here, in theory, they're in this together for life, but it's the stranglehold and the constraints and the issues with the company and the way that it's run, and the fact that they're run as pieces of meat creates that real life tension between them, which, as we've said all along, the Matsunaga brothers, they love that stuff. That's their bread and butter.
And it paid the rent for a while too.
Oh, it did. Bought those big houses until the crash.
So before we wrap up, is there any one particular thing that we haven't talked about in regards to the series that you feel that we really need to address, that really stood out to you?
I think I've said that from I suppose, and again with my kind of film and media head on, from a production perspective, I was incredibly impressed about this. I think I came in and I didn't really know what to expect, because again, my only frame of reference really, and I haven't watched the Ricky Dozan film, but it was My Dad is a Heel Pro Wrestler, was I kind of knew that this wasn't we weren't getting Darren Aronofsky's The Wrestler. We weren't getting something like that. And I was never going to expect that. But instead, what I got was something like, it feels like this was maybe for Netflix Japan. This feels like maybe this was a testing the waters production, and seeing, and I'll be interested to know how well it does. Really, not so much viewing wise worldwide, although I think there will be definitely an audience of wrestling fans, particularly when Raw ends up on Netflix and people are just searching for wrestling on Netflix. I find it hard to believe the algorithm won't come up with this. Well, it will do, and people will find themselves watching it. And I think that's one of the things is that if they're watching this, it's got that sheen that you would want from a Netflix production that makes it feel like, okay, this is an easy thing to watch. It's got, I suppose it's just more overall thoughts that I have, that there are some scenes in it, and particularly like the climactic wrestling match I mentioned in the final episode, the hair versus with the hair versus hair match, and the aftermath as well from that is shot so well. And I think it's actually, they've managed, and the ending, which I'm sure isn't real. I mean, the Dump Matsumoto retirement match, where effectively they just exchange tag team partners and they have a straight wrestling match after this kind of brawl. But it's like a lovely close to all of this, of effectively Chigusa and Dump going back full circle to where they were in the dojo as friends. You have Lioness Asuka able to kind of shine without having Chigusa around her as well. And I'm trying to think of the fourth person in the match as well, who's also
Yukari Omori.
Yukari Omori being like as well out of the extreme evil alliance in there. And then you have Crane Yu coming in, who's retrained to become a referee in there. I thought it was like a lovely way of wrapping it up. And it does all of that stuff. Like, I thought it did really, really well. This is something I thoroughly enjoyed. Like, and I would highly recommend for everyone to watch, even from just you want to watch a 5-part drama on wrestling. This is good. This is good stuff, regardless of any. But I would just say, leave a lot of your preconceptions about what a wrestling drama should be at the door, and you'll enjoy it a lot more.
With regards to how it did domestically, it shot to #1 on Netflix's chart within 24 hours. So, yeah. A lot of people were very curious, and a lot of people burned through it and bumped it all the way to the top. Yeah, the retirement match, I believe the swap, I don't know about the, attacking of the Matsunaga brothers and kicking the referee out and, Crane Yu hopping in the ring, but they do swap partners at her retirement match.
Oh, okay. That was a fair play.
And what got me about that, on top of all of that, I ugly cried through the last 25 minutes of this entire series. But the when she's coming to the ring, like you see her in her dressing room, she's got all the irises behind, or the orchids behind her because she's retiring, and she makes her way down to the ring. Is that along with the family drama, like the parent to child, there is the sister to sister aspect between her and Hiromi, who after Dump turns heel, Hiromi gets dumped by her boyfriend. They start having stalkers show up the house, and she goes through this wild child Yankee phase. She's got a boyfriend who's on a bike. But the costuming that she wears to Dump's last match, she's wearing, what is considered like what they would call like biker girl, biker boy, like biker gang chic. But the embroidery on the back of the jacket, usually the back of the jacket is where you would put a very important message or an homage, or, you would, if you have someone you truly respect, and hers says across the back, the villainous queen, Dump Matsumoto, has Dump's eyes embroidered across the entire back of the jacket. So when she walks up to Dump sees her, and that's why Dump just turns around and wails her with a cane, because the biggest thing that Hiromi was rebelling against throughout this entire series was how much she hated pro wrestling, how much Dump's choices impacted the entire family, and how she was rebelling against, the suffering that continued, even though Dump paid for them to move out to a different house. Her sister finally, they kind of mend that bridge at her. And I don't know if that happened or not, but that was as an older sister who, when we were teens, didn't get along with her younger sister, it really hit me on an existential level. But yeah, again, if you watch it through the lens that this is not designed as a Vice documentary, it is not designed as a very niche just for wrestling fans, that they're trying to make it wrestling as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, to the point where it's getting mainstream international coverage. Try to put try to put your feet in the general audience. We are a very slim sliver of a larger audience that they're trying to reach with this. And I think the wrestlers did a great job in training them. I think the actresses and I always enjoy a good Netflix series, and Japanese dramas, K-dramas are those are my, I live and breathe those. So it has a fair bit of nostalgia for me. But again, I would highly recommend the series, and I am so glad that I was able to spend, oh my God, almost 2 hours. Yes, we didn't go into the nitty-gritty play-by-play, because we want you to go onto your Netflix. We want you to watch the series in whatever language combination that you prefer. I watched both because I also used to do that in Japan, and that's how I also learned Japanese, was learning flip-flopping the English dub and English subtitles with Japanese dub and Japanese subtitles.
Okay.
So it's a good learning tool for those who are trying to learn Japanese, but don't rely exclusively on the practical applications that they seem to have with the language. Don't say a lot of the things that they say in the show to actual people, because it won't go over well. So
fair enough.
In wrapping up, JP, where can people find you?
You can find me at Grapple and Grapple Spotlight. Hopefully we'll have you on soon. out of the, we've got some ideas. It'd be brilliant to have you on with us soon. You can find me on Grapple, where you can find me. We've got our Patreon, which is patreon.com/grapple, youtube.com/@grapple, or wherever you buy and sell podcasts these days, which apparently is a thing. So you can find us on Spotify, Grapple Spotlight, Noe at the end of it as well. You can find me on primarily on social media, but we have our Discord now as well, the Grapple Discord, which is open for everyone to join. But I'm there as Grapple JP on Twitter, although I'm not really on there these days because it seems to be polluted by some of the worst people in the world after bloody another tech billionaire decides he wants to ruin the world by convincing himself he's more of a genius than he actually is. But anyway, I digress. So that's where you can find me.
And yes, we will definitely have to renew the tag team. I have to go make my annual pilgrimage to Grapple. I can't, as I said to you, in messaging when we were getting ready to set this up, I don't want to just show up for the drunken staff party at the end of the year. I gotta if I am to be Grapple's Karen Peterson, I gotta do a kaudashi. I gotta show my face and kind of hang out with make some content with the fellers, as it were. For those who, of course, if you watched this far, you know who I am. You can find me over at Post Pro Res. The October edition is now available, as is September's Dream Slam Monthly. I will be back with Bruce Lord. By the time you hear this, we will be getting ready for New Japan's Royal Quest. We will be watching the Royal Quest and doing a very rare recording immediately after or shortly thereafter, because it'll be the middle of the morning for us.
It's great for you guys. It's a great time to be watching wrestling.
I will take a noon to start time as opposed to a 10 p.m. California show any day of the week. But yeah, for those who have joined us this far, thank you for watching the unofficial, very actual Karen Peterson show, because I've never hosted before. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you can find me over on social media at Hey Karen Sensei, or I do occasionally drop by the Discords of Post and Grapple from time to time, but I'm very much I'm a Luddite when it comes to Discord. So don't message me there because I probably won't see it for weeks at a time. But you can find me on Twitter for now at Hey Karen Sensei, but also on Instagram. So on behalf of myself and my partner in crime, JP, thank you for listening. We'll give you a sweet little arrivederci matana. Bye-bye.
Bye.